Alright, in this video we're going to be looking at how you can set up a JTable in your Java Swing applications and populate that table with data from a database or a file. In this example I'm going to be using a file. I've got just a handful of bills here I've written down, so I've got names of each account and I've got the dollar amount, and I have exported that as a CSV. As a text file, it looks like this. The values are separated by commas. And that's what we're going to be reading into our application. And we're going to put that data into a JTable. To get started here, I've got a class. I just called it main. You can call it whatever you want. And we're going to begin by creating some of our main components. So we're going to need a JFrame. And I need to import my Swing library, so I'm going to do that up here. Import javax.swing.asterisk. All right, we need a scroll pane, so JScrollpane. I call that JS. I also need a JTable, JT. And we're also going to need a string array for our columns. So I call that call string array. And we also need a 2D object array. And this I call data. That's going to be our table data. So there's our components, and we can write a constructor here to set all of this up. For our JFrame, I'm just going to set the title to JTable demo. And before we create our table or our scroll pane, we need to set our two arrays. So our column array is just going to be the titles of our columns. And I'm going to hard code this for the sake of time. Although it may not be the most professional way of doing it, it will still get the point across. So we get a new string array with the values, and our first column will be accounts, and our second column will be the amount. And next we need to set our 2D array, which will be object data. And because this is going to be rather involved, I'm going to write a separate function for that called getData. And I will define that down below my constructor. This function needs to return a 2D array of objects. So that is our return type. And inside this function, I want to open that file, parse out the data, and return it as a 2D array. So to open the file, we're going to need try catch block. Whoops. For the exception, I will just handle it with a print statement and return null. My file is stored in the My Documents folder. You could pass that file name in up here, and that would be a little more professional. But again, I'm just going to hard code it to keep it simple. I'm going to open a buffered reader. And inside here, I'll pass in a new file reader. And we're going to need the path to the My Documents folder. I'm going to go up one line here and create that path. To do that, we're going to call filesystemview.getFileSystemView.getDefaultDirectory.getPath. And this is going to give us the path to the My Documents folder. I'll fix the imports there. We'll have to import those up here at the top. With that path, I also need to include my file name. We get a slash, and then I call this bills.csv. Now that I've got my file open, I can start reading in the data, and I'm going to store that data in an array list before I move it into my object array. Array list. Fix imports, and then I need a string buffer to read in each line of the file. And now I'm going to start my file reading loop. We will use readLine to read in the file line by line. And as long as that is not null, we know there are more lines to be read. And we're going to add each string that is read into our list. So we can do that with add str. And if you want to make sure that your file reader is working correctly, you can do a print statement here and print that string out as well. Now that we've collected the data from the file, we can start packaging it up in our 2D array. So let's create an array here. Object, array, two-dimensional. Again, I will call it data equals new object array. And you know, when you create an array, you need to know the size of that array. For the rows, I can use the size of the list. And that will work fine for the rows. But for the column, I'm going to take one line from my list here and just split it. And however many tokens are in that first row will determine the number of columns in my table. We could just hard code a 2 here because I know I only have 2 columns. But to keep it versatile, we'll go ahead and do a split here. List.get. And we use a 0 to get the first string. And then we're going to call split. And that's going to split it. For our delimiter, we said we were using commas. And then we'll get the length. Split returns an array. We can take the length of that array, and that's going to tell us how many columns are in this file. And then I'll put my in right there. And now I can use a for loop to fill out my array. So I equals 0, I less than list dot length, or I'm sorry, dot size, I plus plus. And we'll just go through the list and set each array or each string as an array to our data array. So you can think of it as populating an array with arrays. Again, we use dot split. So that fills out our object array. And now we can close our file. And we can return our array. Back up here to our constructor. We've got our column information, we've got our table data, and so now we can create our JTable. So JT equals new JTable, and we'll pass in our data, and we'll pass in our column array, and that will set up the table for us. Now we need to add our table to a scroll pane so that table can scroll. JS equals new JScrollpane. And we'll pass in our table. Now we can add our scroll pane to our JFrame. jf.add JS. And we'll just do a little bit of housekeeping here. Our JFrame needs to be able to close, so we'll set the default close operation. And here we'll do exit on close. We can pack our JFrame so all the components are visible and the window is the right size. So jf.pack, and then set visible. jf.set visible, and set that to true. We can go down to main and create a new main, create a new object, and let's see how it goes. And here's our JFrame with its title, and our JTable is in there, and I've got all of my values, so that worked just fine. And you notice if we had more values than our window would support, this does turn into a scroll pane, and we can scroll up and down. So that is how you create a scroll pane and import data from a file.